Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very, very important discussion today about what is going on the Ukrainian border. We've got a terrific panel to discuss this, and there are some major, major questions. What is behind the latest upsurge of friction between Moscow and Kyiv? Is war really going to break out? Where's the United States in all this? Where's NATO in all this? Our four speakers are really top experts, and I'm going to list them in the order in which they're going to speak. Mike Kofman, who happens to be a colleague of mine at the Center for Naval Analysis, but he's full-time. I'm only part-time. He directs the Russia Studies program there. He's also a fellow at the Kennan Institute in Washington, and he specializes in Russia's armed forces, military capabilities, and strategy. Batting second is Melinda Haring, who's deputy director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. She's a former editor of Ukraine Alert. She's vice chair of the board of the East Europe Foundation in Kyiv. She's a member of the supervisory board of the Right to Protection NGO in Ukraine. She's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, with which I also have an affiliation. And given all her affiliations, you can imagine that she is not exactly a very, very popular person in the Kremlin. Then batting third is Keith Darden. He's an associate professor at American University School of International Service. He's an expert on both Ukraine and Russia. He's got a book coming out called Resisting Occupation in Eurasia, and it assesses the development of national loyalties in Ukraine and elsewhere in Eurasia. And finally, a colleague here at the Center for the National Interest, George Beebe, who's vice president and director of studies here at the center. He's a former director of Russia analysis at the CIA. He's the author of The Russia Trap, How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe. And on that very happy note, I will turn immediately to Mike, who can give us a sense of what's going on the ground right now. Michael.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Dov. I think I'll focus on kind of the military developments and the security situation, and at least try to give us a bit of a background or scene setter for what's been happening the last 2 months. I think that what we've witnessed very much since March, and even going back as far as February, is a very significant buildup of Russian troops along Ukraine's borders. It's definitely the largest we've seen since 2014. It is also the largest deployment of Russian forces to Crimea since they annexed the peninsula. And we've seen a readiness spike across different military districts, because simultaneously the Russian military is conducting a host of snap readiness checks and drills, in part in preparation for Zapad 2021, which viewers might know is coming up later in September, and focused on the Western military district. So this situation kind of begins a bit in February. There are some Russian exercises and some airborne unit deployments to Crimea, and it doesn't look like Russia rotates those troops back. Since then, they've begun a buildup, primarily in two areas, one in Crimea, the other one over in Voronezh, and a couple of parts that are sort of northeast of Ukraine. And they're bringing units from outside the region, from Southern Military District, from the northern part of Western Military District, and from Central Military District as well. And just to give people a sense, so we're talking about airborne units coming from Pskov up north, opposite Estonia. We have units as far flung as Yurga, all the way in central Russia, traveling several thousand kilometers by rail. We have a lot of the 58th Army from the Southern Military District coming from different parts of it, all the way from Makhachkala towards the eastern part of the Caucasus, from Borzoi in Chechnya, and other parts, right? So we have all these units gathering, a host of airborne units coming in as well. Now, the Russian military has announced different readiness checks and exercises, for example, March 31st, Southern Military District, but these looked very clearly like post hoc justifications. They were pretty disingenuous. So as they came after the troop movements were spotted, it was clear that this was not a regular exercise. These were not regular troop rotations. And the justification announcements they were making were not encompassing of the activity that anyone could observe. In fact, this was observable throughout late March and through today. There are still troops right now moving to these areas. So we don't know ultimately how many forces they're going to deploy, right? It's a moving target. Now, the ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, which had largely held for a while, broke down last month. There's been a cycle of escalation, although it's been fairly limited compared to previous episodes where often would erupt into major artillery duels. That's not to say that it won't. This still may come in the near future, and as a space to watch. Ukrainian forces also began moving some units in March, starting in early March, anticipating escalation, looking some of the activity on the Russian side, but also hedging, I think perhaps on their own end towards the line of contact in the Donbass. Although their response has been pretty limited in terms of what they've shifted towards the line of control. And it's important to frame this, I think, in fairly that the military balance is decidedly not in Ukraine's favor. On the contrary, since 2014, Russia has deployed a host of fairly large tactical formations on a permanent basis around Ukraine, divisions, brigades, an entire new combined arms army. And the Russian military continues to outnumber Ukraine, both in quality and quantity. It's important to kind of frame the understanding of the genuine military balance. This is not including the separatist or Russian-led forces in the Donbass, the two sort of separatist army corps. The Russian forces have been brought in are in addition to these permanent formations. And from what one can tell, they're not actually rotating troops into the Donbass. Instead, they're stacking them more often to Crimea and the other parts of Ukraine's borders. The estimates on size vary. This is very difficult to get a good hold of in terms of the numbers we're looking at. If we count some of the forces that are based around Ukraine, along with the ones that are brought in total, it could range to 80 or 100,000. If we're speaking discretely about combat functional elements, that is, maneuver formations capable of conducting offensive operations, it's probably much more like 25 or 30,000, but this is a fairly significant number. It's just not easy to tell looking at the situation. All right, here's the sort of the good news, or perhaps the silver lining in this discussion. Currently, Russian forces are deploying in large assemblies by training areas. They've not been trying to hide these movements. They've made them very overt. In this respect, their deployment is quite different from 2014. And they are not moving to staging points or dispersing, which would be a good indicator, perhaps in the coming week, if Russia really had offensive intentions, or perhaps a worst case scenario. So the expectation is most likely they will conduct some highly visible drills. And as Shoigu, the Russian Minister of Defense, just today suggested, they might begin to withdraw within the coming 2 weeks. That's a very optimistic assessment, right? It's unclear what Russian intentions are, what they're going to do. The more pessimistic one is that Russia is really spoiling for a fight and looking to bait Ukraine into a major miscalculation. They'll give them a casus belli, right, to use force. I'll close out briefly, at least on my hypothesis of what the Russian goals might be. I see this as fundamentally coercive diplomacy, a very, very overt and clear demonstration of Russian military power and the potential to inflict considerable harm in Ukraine. I think that escalation on the line of contact for now is probably likely, but I find at least a major war improbable. It's not clear what political goals or objectives Russia could effectively achieve with use of force against Ukraine right now. But on the other hand, I think as any reasonable analyst, you cannot discount it. First of all, the intentions are unclear. Second of all the Russian justification explanations have been pretty post hoc and disingenuous. You do have to look at capabilities and assume worst case scenario, right? So you have to hedge. There is some confirming and disconfirming evidence. I'll be frank, it is not a very clear picture. And if it was, UCOM would not have raised its WatchCon, seeing this as a probable crisis. I do believe that the Russian intent is to shape Ukrainian thinking, Ukrainian policies, and Zakharova also came out recently and made some very clear overt threats about the prospect of what might happen if a NATO membership action plan map was advanced to Ukraine. And so there have been a host of messages from those who speak on behalf of the Kremlin regarding why they're doing this and what their intentions are. So I won't further speculate on this. I'm sure we'll have a wonderful conversation, and I'll turn it back to you and to the rest of my colleagues on the panel.
Well, thanks very much. Melinda, what's Putin really up to here? He saw how Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan really put the Chinese on their, really surprised them with the tough talk. The president has pretty much said that Putin's a killer. Is this a message to the president? Is Biden being tested? And of course, Putin's popularity isn't fantastic, but obviously, as soon as you try a some kind of adventure, particularly in Russia. Your popularity skyrockets. So what's he up to, Melinda?
Thanks for the opportunity to be here, Dov. Great to be with Michael, George, and Keith, and all of you today. That's what I've been wondering about. I think that's the big question. Why now, and what are the triggers? I see four, and to answer your question discreetly, Dov, it's because he can. The West hasn't imposed significant costs on Putin since 2014 to prevent him from breaking the rules of the game. I think you're right that he is testing the Biden administration. He's also trying to humiliate Ukraine and Zelensky. Those points, though, on retaliation are both, those points on the U.S. and on Zelensky are both related to retaliation. Biden called Putin a killer, and Zelensky imposed sanctions on Medvedchuk, and he banned several Russian language television stations earlier this year. But there's also a bigger, broader point, and this is a point that my colleague Stephen Pfeiffer likes to make. He wants to make Ukraine look like a failed state. He wants the Europeans to ask, why on earth would we let this country in when it has enormous problems on its border? I agree with Michael right now that it doesn't look like that the situation is going to escalate. Yes, there's a huge number of troops. It's the largest number of troops that we've seen since 2014. But again, I agree with my colleagues that the costs outweigh the benefit at this point. And I think that there's at least 5 reasons why. So number one is that this is not going to be a walk in the park like it was with Crimea. If Putin escalates, so some analysts are saying that Putin wants to take 3 cities on the Black Sea. He wants to take Berdyansk, Mariupol, and Odessa, plus the canal in Kherson Oblast. There will be massive bloodshed. Yes, Michael is absolutely right that the Russians have more troops, they're stronger, they're better, but the Ukrainians have improved a lot. This is not going to be like Crimea, and it's not going to be popular in Ukraine. So that's one reason I don't think that it will escalate. Number two, it's probably in his interest, it's probably in Putin's interest to wait. We know that Merkel's out in the fall, and she's been very instrumental in holding the EU sanctions together. We don't know who her replacement will be, but the person probably will not have the same background or instincts that she does. So that's one more reason to wait. Yes, number 3, Putin could use a boost in his popularity. He's got a massive number of domestic problems. He's got Navalny, who's probably dying. He has declining popularity. He has a terrible economy, and he's got COVID. But he won't necessarily get that spike because it won't be easy. He did get those big boosts in 2008 from Georgia, in 2014 from Crimea. But it looks like the public is getting weary of these sort of small, glorious wars. Number 5, this is a point Michael made. It's worth making again. It's the largest Russian troop buildup since 2014, and people are very worried. But the troop movements have been visible. They haven't tried to hide it whatsoever, and that's a really important point. So I think it is saber rattling. Number 5, and this is another one that we need to emphasize again and again. Moscow doesn't want the Donbass. It's a giant money pit. Many of the people who remain behind are pensioners. It would be, and there's been massive destruction there. There's $1 billion price tag to fix it. So I think at this point, it's unlikely that things are going to escalate. Some of my colleagues have said that Putin wants to keep all options on the table, and he hasn't decided yet what he wants. And that sounds very reasonable and smart to me. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Keith, let me ask you about the view from Ukraine, and actually 2 views, if I may. One is, does Zelensky think he has cards? That's number 1. And number 2, what about all the folks in Donetsk and Luhansk who would love nothing more than the Russians to take it over openly? Or maybe not. What do they want? And how do they see all of this playing out?
Okay, yeah, I think Melinda and I agree on almost everything, which is rare. But then the question is, why are the Russians building up forces on the Ukrainian border? If the timing isn't good, if there's not much to be gained in terms of domestic public opinion, what is it that they're up to? If they were, if this were simply show, the show would have been better to do later in the year. So I don't think it's just show. And I think that the Russians are responding, as they often have, as they did in 2014, as they have in the intervening years under Petro Poroshenko, to internal dynamics within Ukrainian politics that they think that they can influence. And I think that they can influence those events, and that it may end up with much more significant offensive action because of what's going on currently in Ukraine. Melinda mentioned some of the dynamics in Ukraine that have been happening in the last several months. But I think we're not seeing how significant a shift this is. Remember, Zelensky was elected as the president of inclusion, right? This was, we're not going to be divided by faith. We're not going to be divided by language. I'm going to pursue peaceful settlement in the Donbass and pursue anti-corruption. That is not the Zelensky we have seen for the last 3 months. And so part of the timing, I think, of Russian actions is timed with some of the behavior of the Zelensky government. And the Zelensky government has signaled that Minsk is dead and that their willingness to cooperate in any way or to work politically with pro-Russian forces domestically has come to an end as well. And so Zelensky has used a sort of a novel form of sanctions to essentially purge the ranks of pro-Russian forces inside Ukraine. So the leadership of the opposition Bloc Party for Life. He's attacked Viktor Medvedchuk. He's banned and closed 3 television stations that express pro-Russian opinions. And it's important to remember that while these might be popular moves in Ukraine as a whole, they're extremely unpopular moves, as this to answer your question, Dov, in the areas of Ukraine that are bordering Russia. And so this is not popular in Kharkiv, it's not popular in Donetsk and Luhansk, and it's possibly not popular in Odessa either. And so you have to think that Zelensky is saying this notion that we're going to negotiate our way out of this, forget it. We're not even going to negotiate with the pro-Russian forces on our own territory now, let alone these forces that are backed by Russia in the Donbass. And so what does the post-Minsk world look like for Russia? Russia achieved a peaceful settlement in Minsk, largely because they had superior military force. And it was a compromise for them. They forewent pursuing further military gains on the condition that there would be constitutional changes in Ukraine and that these regions would be integrated. The Zelensky government is saying there's going to be no constitutional change. These regions are not going to be integrated. We are effectively purging the ranks of your allies inside Ukraine. And so what does that leave the Russians, right? It leaves the return to that pre-Minsk world, which was where this is going to get settled possibly on the battlefield, in which Russia has tremendous advantages. And so I think we have to worry that, and you hear these signals from Washington as well, that Minsk is dead. We should basically be trying to renegotiate a settlement of Russian withdrawal. But Russia is de facto in a position of superior power here. And so we are putting them in a position where they have an incentive to demonstrate that power militarily. And so long as we place them in that situation, I think there's a risk of further military engagement.
Well, that's a very optimistic view of things. By the way, before I turn to George to kind of literally bat cleanup and give us his perspectives on all facets of this discussion, I just want to let the audience know that if you have questions, just hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and that the staff here will ensure that it shows up on my chat, and then I can call on folks. So, George, go ahead.
Thanks, Dov. I'll encompass all 3 of our panelists' remarks in my comments here. I think Mike is absolutely right. The Russian military moves that we're seeing here are meant for effect. I don't believe they're meant for an invasion of Ukraine, at least not yet. They're not doing the kinds of things that you would expect them to do if they were in fact preparing to invade. And it's obvious that they want everyone to know what they're doing. They're being quite ostentatious in their maneuvers. They want people to see it. So that raises the question of, okay, then who are they trying to influence? What effects do they intend? What audiences do they have in mind? And I would cite 3. The first being the Ukrainian government, and I'm sympathetic to what Keith has just described about what's been going on inside Ukraine. His actions against the pro-Russian elements in Ukraine are not just unpopular in the Donbass, they're also very unpopular in Russia. The Russians are paying a lot of attention to what Zelensky is doing internally, to the way he's treating Russian speakers and Russian sympathizers inside Ukraine. And it's controversial in Russia. And we tend to think of Putin as somebody who has infinite elasticity politically, that his rule is unchallenged, that he doesn't have to worry about opposition from his right. And we tend to think of him as on the right side of Russia's political spectrum, as being an extremist. I think by Russia's standards, he's a centrist on the Russian political spectrum. And he does have to worry about his political right. And I don't think it's accidental that a lot of Russian spokesmen, in commenting about what's been going on in Ukraine, have explicitly cited the precedent of the massacre in Srebrenica in the Balkans in the 1990s. And part of what's going on here is Putin is sending messages to his political right that he's not going to abandon Russian speakers in Ukraine. And he's also sending that same message to Kyiv. Don't even think about starting something. And he's made this quite explicit. He has accompanied those military maneuvers that Mike has described with a quite explicit statement that if Ukraine thinks it's in its interest to start a war, then Ukraine very likely is not going to survive intact as a state. I don't think it could be much more explicit than that. And the message is obvious, don't go there. Now, another audience obviously is the West, the United States and Europe. But I don't think the message there is quite what a lot of people assume it is here in the United States. A lot of people assume that the message is, we're coming, we're going to see if you're men enough to stand up to our intimidation. We're testing you to see if you're going to react or not, if you're going to show strength here or not. And if you don't, then we'll just keep right on moving. I don't think that's the message that they're sending. I think the message they have in mind actually is Georgia in 2008, where from Russia's point of view, the United States mishandled its client state. We didn't rein them in. In fact, we did things to encourage them to be reckless, I think ignorantly, but the Russians, I think, are much less charitable in their assessment of our actions there. But their message to us is, don't let your folks in Ukraine get reckless, because there will be a disaster that will come here. And unlike the United States, Russia sees this as in its vital interest. Russia will go to war over this. And that's not something we want. So make sure the Ukrainians don't do things that threaten stability here. I don't think that's the message that a lot of Americans think the Russians are sending, but I do think the Russians believe that's the message that they're trying to send to the United States and Europe.
Well, thanks very much. And that actually is a scary thing, because wars very often begin because of essentially cognitive dissonance, which is what you're talking about. It's not at all clear that NATO or the Biden administration are receiving the message that the Russians want to transmit. And that leads me to a question before I turn it over to the audience. What actually can the United States do? NATO had a meeting today. They didn't do very much. Even if NATO tried to do something, Hungary or another country could block it. They obviously have to work by consensus. So what can we really do? I mean, we've sanctioned a lot of people already. Anybody on the panel, or several of you, want to address that?
Sure, I'll jump in.
Go ahead,
There's
Mike.
heck of a lot.
And I think Keith will go next. I think you had your hand up too. Go
Oh,
ahead, Melinda.
Go ahead. Okay,
No,
sorry.
Melinda, go ahead.
There's a heck of a lot that can be done, Dov. The U.S. is sending two ships over right now. That's just a start. The javelins, there are no restrictions on their usage, and we can make that clear. We can share satellite intelligence with the Ukrainians. We can also get serious about increasing the sanctions. So the experts tell me on a 1 to 10 scale, the sanctions that the United States has put in place since 2014 are about a 3 or 4. If you really wanted to change Russian behavior, the experts tell me you need to blacklist a few Russian banks, and that would be a big deal. And we haven't done that yet. And we would need to do it in a packaged way. We would need to tell the Russians that this is coming if they escalate and bring the Europeans on board. My colleagues have just written a paper that outlines 5 or 6 different places where it would lead to a significant change in behavior. And I'm happy to post the specifics in the chat below.
That'll be great. Keith, you wanted to.
Yeah, I don't think anything that the US government is going to do is going to tip the military balance in this situation. And so I don't think signaling that we're providing military backing or other forms of support to the Ukrainian government is going to get us out. To the extent that I believe that what got us into this crisis was the removal of political factions within Ukraine. That happened to some extent with US blessing, and it was timed to coincide with the takeover of the Biden administration. And so from a Russian perspective, it looks like those two things are linked. And maybe we should make it clear to the Russians that we don't support the removal of political factions from Ukrainian politics through extrajudicial means.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. George, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll offer a little bit of a different perspective on what I think we can and should do in this. First of all, our goal ought to be crisis prevention. We should look at this not as a situation where we can resolve this, accomplish something proactively. What we ought to be keeping in mind here quite firmly is we want to make sure that this does not spiral into a catastrophe. That's number one. Now, how do you do that? I don't think you do it by trying to signal to either the Ukrainians or the Russians that the United States has Ukraine's back here. I think the danger with the Ukrainians is that it might inspire them to take risks that they otherwise wouldn't take and that they can't back up, and that we are not actually going to defend them against if push comes to shove. The second thing is, I think the Russians are not going to be impressed by rhetoric. They're only going to be impressed by actual actions. And these are actions that I don't think we're actually willing to take. So I don't think we ought to threaten them. What I think we ought to do is talk to the Russians about some things that they don't want that could actually come to pass here if they mishandle this. One is, Melinda pointed out that the Russians would have a difficult time keeping and securing territory that they were able to conquer in Ukraine. That's certainly true of the western portions of Ukraine. I don't have any doubt that the Russians would have early success on the battlefield in a direct conflict with the Ukrainians. I have grave doubts that over the longer term, they could actually control and secure that territory. And one of the things I would say to the Russians is, look, you're going to have difficulty there. We're going to make sure you have difficulty there. And that's not a situation where you want your military bogged down over the long term, in guerrilla warfare against Ukrainian units. And that's a real threat. And I think that would have some impact in Russian calculations. The other thing that is a grave danger here is that the Russians stop, along a north-south line somewhere to the west of Donbass. And they simply say, we're going to recognize the independence of the so-called People's Republic. And you end up in a permanent division of Ukraine, which would translate into a permanent division of Europe. And I don't think the Russians want that. That doesn't actually add to Russian security. It doesn't accomplish any of the things that I think Putin or anybody else in the Russian leadership really wants to conquer. It's a very real prospect if push comes to shove and we end up with a direct conflict here. And I think the prospect of that is something Putin doesn't want. And that's part of the reason why we haven't seen the kind of real offensive military action that the Russians.
Well, thank you. I think you're frozen there, but you sounded like you were almost at the end. Melinda, and then I want to go to some of the questions that are up there. George, you're frozen, by the way. Melinda, please.
Thank you. Just a quick response to George. 3 points, I'll be fast. On de-escalating the conflict, I couldn't agree more with George, but I think it's important to point out that both sides are not equal in this conflict, and Russia is the aggressor. The French and Germans issued a ridiculous statement calling on the Russians and the Ukrainians to de-escalate and acting like the Ukrainians are just at fault. That's ridiculous. Number two, it's too late. The United States has already said that Ukraine has our unwavering support. It's too late on that point. And then number three, I agree with George that the Russians are not impressed by our rhetoric, and we have to have real actions. And it's not enough to say that there's going to be severe consequences. We should be specific, and there's a number of options that policymakers should and can consider, and some of them are in that paper that I posted below. Thank you.
Michael, I know you want to jump into this as well, but I also have a question for you from Evan Sankey, so I'll give you both. He's asking, have we learned anything new about Russia's military modernization from the buildup that's going on? Are there any surprises? So why don't you take that as well as the comments you wanted to make about what we've just been discussing?
I mean, I personally don't see any surprise in the modernization and deployment, as I think those of us who have observed the Russian military have seen a tremendous improvement in their ability to deploy forces over long distances, the logistical throw and ability to move these formations. And they increasingly have much higher readiness, much better logistical tail behind them, a much more modernized force, and they have a larger force structure to boot, especially a larger ground force structure. And these developments, I think those who follow the Russian military have been tracking over the course of years. This is not even the real demonstration of it. If you find this worrisome, then wait till August, September of this year. Zappa 2021 is likely to be a very big exercise. And this deployment is going to be a relatively small prelude likely to that deployment. So stay tuned. If you're looking to learn from Russian military deployments, what's likely going to come later this year. I had just a very brief comment on the discussion, if I could. I want to make 3 points. The first two will be bad news comments. One, that I don't believe that territorial acquisition has ever been the Russian goal here, and this is somewhat a canard. The goal is to use force to compel Ukraine to a settlement favorable to Russian political objectives, not to end up owning parts of Ukraine or having to pay for them, so on and so forth, right? It's to impose Russian will upon Ukraine, and most importantly, to have a say over Ukraine's strategic orientation without owning it or paying for it. So these dreams that are often spun about the fact that Russia wants to own this coast or all these cities and this, that, and other stuff, this is just, I don't believe this to be true, right? No offense to the people that live in these wonderful cities. A lot of my family's from Odessa. It's a great city, okay? But I'm just saying that I just don't believe that it's Russian objective to capture and seize Odessa or some of these other towns. Second, about javelins, I have bad news as well. Tactical capabilities do not deter anything. Realistically, they do not aggregate towards deterrence. They are war-fighting capabilities. I'm going to tell you why, all right? They are not meaningful to political leaders who make the actual decisions on war. They do not know and do not care about the Javelin versus the Concourse versus the other missile or the third missile, okay? They don't stay up at night reading technical manuals about this stuff. This is meaningless to them. This is defense analyst talk. They don't know who has the best version of the tank, and they don't care. Right? The difference is between a 5-foot fence to them, if we're talking about deterrence and military ability, and a 5-foot fence and 1 inch. Okay, that's basically what you're arguing. And it makes no difference. These are useful warfighting capabilities, and they're a great hedge when deterrence fails. But don't ever believe that these capabilities actually deter political leaders in their decision making. They are not operative in decisions on war. Wars have political causes. Okay, they are not. This is a very small percentage of the calculus. Last, on what the United States should do. Well, I think what we shouldn't do, or at least clarify, is in part what we've already done, which is we tend to signal vague, broad commitments without explaining what they mean. And we also vaguely tend to signal costs without expressing what they are or what they're going to be. And then often when asked, we say, well, we'll reply at a time and place of our choosing with a thing we haven't figured out yet that we might do. So I hope this is a great deterrent for you. And Russians will, of course, like anybody else, will logically assume that the cost will be the lowest common denominator of whatever we agree with to the Europeans, who will have to impose a number of these costs. That is not that scary or threatening in a lot of cases. I think we do a lot of the right things by voicing restraint and seeking to both deter Russia and also dissuade people from basically making the worst case choice in those scenarios. But I think beyond the phone call that Biden made to Zelensky, I'm actually glad that he did end up talking to Putin today. There has to be a much clearer message about what the costs are. Okay, you can't expect opponents to effectively be deterred by costs you've never voiced. They're just pretty straightforward. Second, you have to make clear what your commitment is. What is our commitment to Ukraine? We made a good rhetorical commitment, but what does any of that stuff really mean? What should the Russians take from that? Because I don't know what it means. I don't know if Keith knows. I don't know if George or Melinda know for a fact what that actually means in terms of our commitment. And if we don't know, I don't think the Russians can be expected to realistically walk away with a clear message from that either. Thank you.
Well, and of course, Mr. Putin has a memory, as do the Russians. They tend to have a much longer memory than we do, so they remember what we did when they moved into Hungary, and they remember what we did when they moved into Czechoslovakia, which was a big zero. So that's a little scary too. John Evans has a double-barreled question, and whoever wants to take it. First, Dmitry Trenin had a piece at Carnegie, which pretty much said that Russian troop movements were intended to forestall more serious action in the future. So do you believe that? I think you've hinted at it, but perhaps you want to address it explicitly. And then John also says he heard on radio that Biden called Putin and suggested a meeting. Do you have any idea about this and the readout? So please, who wants to take those two? Yeah, Keith.
Yeah, I'll take the first one. It's a question of what does he want to forestall? I think that's correct. And, you know, some of the language is we want to forestall any illusions about a Karabakh scenario on the part of the Ukrainians. We do not want them thinking that, you know, a handful of Turkish drones and some Javelin missiles mean that they're going to retake these areas by force and settle this with some NATO support advisors. So they want to make it clear that the balance of forces in this situation is very different from the situation in the South Caucasus, and kind of reset expectations on the Ukrainian side and in Ankara and in Washington about what's likely to happen here, right? And so that's a strong signal. I think they're also signaling to the Ukrainians internally, and I'll just read something from the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Danilov, about the continuing sanction policy. He says, I'm confident that in the near future, sanctions will continue against certain categories of people, both individuals and legal entities. Moreover, I can say with confidence that there will be sanctions against a number of deputies sitting in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine today. We have more than enough grounds to implement this, and if someone thinks that this is a one-time action, he is deeply mistaken. And I think the Russians are signaling that that should not be carried forward anymore. Right. And so that there will be potentially external consequences of taking out internal forces within Ukraine that are going to be part of an imagined settlement process. So I think there are these two things that the Russians are signaling about.
Well, Keith, since you've got the floor, I have a question that I think really is directed at you from Steve Szabo. How supportive is the Ukrainian public for what Zelensky is doing? We know what Zelensky's doing. We know what what they think about it in the Donbass area. But what about the people in Western Ukraine, for instance?
If you look at Ukrainian polling in aggregate, it's popular. So that, you know, there was a dip in Zelensky's popularity, which is partly why I think he has changed course. But, you know, Medvedchuk was not a popular figure broadly in Ukraine. The opposition bloc, you know, Party for Life also, you know, doesn't do so well in Ukraine more broadly. But I guess the important thing is regionally, it is very unpopular. And so I don't think you should ever talk about Ukraine in aggregate. I think it's important to think about how it gets filtered through different regional lenses, and the regions of concern, you know, associated with military conflict are the ones that find this most objectionable. So it's kind of a mixed bag in the sense that it does help his popularity overall, but it hurts him in the East and to some extent in the South.
Let me ask you all this. Let's say that maybe it's September, that Putin does move. I don't know whether he slices off a part, whether he sends in airborne troops just to help the Luhansk and Donetsk folks, whatever. But he does something more than just massing troops on the border. And he gets away with it because NATO can't do anything on its as an institution. Individual countries can. It's not clear what they would do. How does that impact the China-Taiwan issue? Because the Chinese, we make a mistake. We always make this mistake. We think that everything is compartmentalized and that the bad guys don't look at what the other bad guys are doing. But guess what? They do. So maybe any one of you want to respond to that. What do you think the Chinese would do if the Russians got away with it? Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, I'll make a brief comment. So just this current episode that we're now watching unfold is really interesting because you are seeing two coincidental, and I do believe they are coincidental, but very relevant military courses displays by both China over Taiwan and Russia over Ukraine. And they're very useful for, I think, our broader conversation about the implications of Russia-China alignment, because what's happening is the United States already, very early on to this administration, is seeing its bandwidth of situational awareness tremendously stressed by the activity of these two powers in two very different cases. And these activities go on for several months. So even if they didn't start together, if it's not premeditated, it doesn't matter. They're obviously not idiots. They can see that the United States is being pulled off and stretched by another power's actions. And Europeans have to come to a realization that Europe is decidedly the second theater for the United States. The priority is on China and on the Pacific theater. They have to recognize that. And so there is every possibility that tensions between the United States and China over Taiwan will get worse, and tensions between Russia and Ukraine, or United States and NATO and Russia, are going to get worse. And this picture could get very interesting towards August and September as U.S. resources are stretched thin. You just don't know how the situation is going to develop. So I don't believe, I think sort of opportunistic aggression by two states at the same time in totally different theaters, I think that that's very rare and in some cases unlikely. But it's nonetheless important to remember that the United States does not have the luxury of dealing with Russia separately in one theater and China separately in another theater at the same time. And Europeans sometimes think that no matter what happens with Russia, they'll be number one on the U.S. priority and agenda list. The United States will be desperate to come here first. But that is really increasingly not the case. The U.S. really actually does have to reconcile two very difficult competing priorities.
Any other thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, Dov, a couple of thoughts on this. In one sense, your question reminds me of an old debate during the Cold War about credibility. And we got ourselves into some problems, as you recall, because we convinced ourselves that everything was a test of our credibility, of our resolve. And so it eroded our ability to distinguish between things that were vital to American national security and things that were of secondary or tertiary interest, things that were nice to do but not vital to the United States and its core national interests. And so we convinced ourselves that we had to respond in areas that were peripheral. And our commitments, I think, went beyond our capabilities, and that caused some real problems here. Now, why does this remind me of the situation we're facing right now vis-a-vis Russia and China? Both Ukraine and Taiwan are, from the perspectives of Moscow and Beijing, vital national interests. These are clearly things that they will fight to defend. The question is, are they things that the United States should fight to defend? Is it in our vital national interests to go to war with China over Taiwan? And by the way, we don't have a formal defense commitment with Taiwan, although many Americans seem to think we do. Is it in our vital interest to go to war with Russia over Ukraine? If it's not, in both instances, then what's most important, I think, for US credibility is to make sure there's an alignment between what we commit ourselves to do and what we're capable of doing and what's in our vital national interest to do. When those things get out of alignment, bad things occur and you get bluffs called, right? Where people say, oh, you say you're going to do this? Let's see. And then you realize, well, actually, we're not going to do that because it's not in our national interest to do it. And we don't have the capability to back up that threat. That's not where we ought to be.
I want to combine two questions. John Evans has another one for Mike, which is that Andrei Kortunov said yesterday he thought the Ukrainians wanted to do what Aliyev did in the Karabakh War using Turkish drones. And I think you've addressed that to some extent. But you might want to expand on that. Do the Russians worry about the Bayraktars? But secondly, Jacob Halbrun had a related question, which was, how bloody would a bloody nose be if the Ukrainians hit back? What would be the cost to the Russians? So maybe, Mike, you want to take that, and our other panelists could follow up.
Yeah, I'll take this in two parts. So there are plenty of people in Russian military defense circles that kind of throw out the sphere that Ukraine might take these lessons from Azerbaijan's victory in Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm going to tell you that most of that is smoke. First of all, what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh is terribly oversold. And actually, Azerbaijani casualties were quite high, and it was a lot less easy than it appears. Second, while the Russian military very much worries about drones, it does not worry about that kind of drone and the drone that Turkey has, like TB2s. This is not a problem for them. And in fact, if you see outside of the context where Azerbaijan, with tremendous quantitative and qualitative superiority and near non-existent air defense on the part of Armenians, is able to walk over them. When Turks deployed their drones, even against very limited Russian air defenses in places like Libya, frankly, equipped by mercenaries, their success rate is not that great. It's actually proven quite costly. Turkey's lost 22 drones last year alone, and it's lost a lot in Libya just this year, and this year is very young. So their kill death ratio is not that great with these drones. There's a technical comment. That's not what worries the Russians. And they don't believe that Ukraine can seriously pull this off that quickly. It's almost an unrealistic debate. The correlation of forces actually is not that much in Ukraine's favor, just looking at the two separatist army corps alone and the big 150th division that backs them just across the border as part of the 8th Army. This is just one small chunk of the force arrayed against them. So it would be much harder, infinitely harder. Okay, the second question, how bloody would it be and what's the cost? So it really depends on the scope of the operation and their duration. Everything it depends, and much is contingent on war. I will say this first. There's no Russian intent to occupy or conduct prolonged occupation of large parts of Ukrainian territory. Second, they're not going to fight more or longer than they have to in order to compel some political settlement. Third, most of these conflicts are a lot shorter than people think they're going to be and very intense. That is the lesson to take from the Nagorno-Karabakh War. It's the lesson to take from the Russia-Georgia War. It's the lesson to take from August 2014 and from February, March 2015, all right? That's the reality of it. Most of these sort of Excel spreadsheets that you see when people show forces, they're relevant. Excel spreadsheets don't fight, okay? This is paper. This is stuff on paper. That's not how real war works. That's not how it turns out. So it could be intense. It could be very short. They could have a fight of a week or two. I'll kind of make this point that without extended or extensive logistics, oftentimes Russian battalion tactical groups, when you see them deploy, they don't deploy from the looks of it prepared to fight for more than, let's say, a week or two or something along those lines. So the truth of it is that it very much depends on the kind of operation they choose to conduct, the scope of it. And while a lot can be said about the prospect for Ukrainian resistance, I want to very much caution people not to oversell the story. The Russian military is also very different from the military that fought in 2014 and 2015. It is much better, much capable, much more ready, and has a very, very different level of combat experience. And the Russian signaling is very clear that the next war is not going to be a very brief, small line of contact engagement with 8 to 10 battalion tactical groups engaging Ukrainian forces, right? They are signaling very overtly there'll be a much larger scale conflict, right, where they will try to envelop Ukrainian forces deployed east. So, like I said, it all depends. I'm sorry to give you this answer, but military power needs a context to express itself. Only couch experts are able to look at spreadsheets and say who's going to win and how much it'll cost them.
On
So-
that note, George, you have some comments.
Yeah, a quick comment on how bloody that bloody nose might be. I think the real danger for the Russians here is not battlefield losses. It's not damage militarily. It's a you break it, it's yours problem, which the United States is not unfamiliar with. If I think correctly asserts the Russians are trying to compel action, some political decision in Ukraine. I think they're in grave danger of breaking the government in Kyiv, of breaking Ukraine. And what happens in the aftermath of that is not some orderly rebuilding, reconstitution of a viable state there. You could very easily end up with a failed state situation, with a vacuum of government in Ukraine. And that's on Russia's borders, and it becomes a tremendous problem, I think, for Russia, administratively, practically, and politically. I don't think they want that. In fact, I think that would be a disastrous outcome for Russian interests, but one that I could easily see happen if this situation is mismanaged.
Let me, Melinda, did you want to?
Yeah, George,
Jump in.
I missed something. Could you restate the argument again about what would cause Kiev to fall apart? I missed part of it.
Well, my reasoning is this. They want the Ukrainian government, they want Kiev to agree to some variation of the Minsk Accord. In fact, not a variation of the Minsk Accord. They want to agree to the Minsk terms, period. I don't believe that any government in Kiev can survive if it were to agree to the terms of Minsk as they now are. That's number one. And if Russia turns up the use of force to the point where a government in Ukraine is compelled to implement Minsk, I think it falls. And I also think that if there is actual direct conflict on the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine, there's going to be an enormous setback for the Ukrainian government. And I don't think whichever government is in power at the time survives that either politically. That's my reasoning.
Gotcha.
Let me,
Can I jump in for a minute, Dov?
Sorry, Melinda, you wanted to say something?
Is it okay if I jump in? I think Michael's absolutely right on the question on how bloody things will be. You can map out different scenarios on it would probably, like taking Mariupol wouldn't be as bloody as taking Odessa. You can map these things out, and Michael can tell you, how long it would take, how many troops it would take. He's right. The Russian forces are stronger. Ukrainian forces are much better than they were. They're a ragtag army. There's all kinds of reporting about it, how they didn't have equipment or shoes back in 2014. And that's changed. We all want to avoid that. I had two other points. I wanted to go back to what Keith said. I agree with him that Zelensky's likely to get a boost from this escalation. He hasn't been doing very well domestically. There's a number of reasons to worry about what's happening in Ukraine. They're backsliding massively on their reforms. So in a way, no one wants to go to war, but if he plays this well and doesn't escalate and it stays calm, he probably will get a boost in his polling. His numbers have been falling since he became president. He was at 73% 2 years ago. And then on Taiwan, I'm sorry I didn't jump in aggressively enough earlier. I think the big fear, though, is if the US and the West don't stand up, if Russia does indeed go after a piece of Ukraine, then that will give a green light to other nations that might makes right. And that is against the rules of the international order. It's against US foreign policy. We have to stand up for these places. I concede the point, George, that China's willing to go to war and Russia's willing to go to war for Ukraine, and we're not doing that. But there are other options short of war to avert both of those outcomes.
Let me ask a question. Michael talked, we actually had several discussions about these Turkish drones. Let me ask you all a question about Erdogan. On the one hand, he's spoken to Zelensky and he sold some drones. On the other hand, he wants to get rid of the Montreux Treaty, which is something Peter the Great wanted. Where is Erdogan on this? And, for us, he seems to be a wild card. Is there any way we can influence this guy? What are your thoughts? No, that's, I'm prompting a lot of answers here.
Everyone's afraid of the Turks. They have a powerful lobbying wing in Washington. But I think that the real problem is that Turkey is inherently unpredictable and has shown an eagerness to use force outside of its borders. Right. So whether it's Libya, whether it's Azerbaijan, and so it's not out of the question that there could be Turkish advisors flying the Turkish drones in an escalation on Ukrainian territory because of what we've seen from Erdogan recently. And he often doesn't win. So I think the argument that he won't do it because it is unwise militarily is not a very persuasive predictor of Erdogan's actions. So I agree, there's not much that we can do about him, partly because he controls the Bosphorus. And so NATO doesn't want to drop him. But he's very much a wild card here and everywhere else on Turkey's borders.
Any other thoughts? Then let me ask you about another country that plays with both Ukraine and Russia, and that's the Israelis. Where do you see the Israelis in all of this?
That's an interesting relationship. It's interesting that Russia has a fairly sustained defense cooperation relationship with Israel and a sort of a deconfliction of operations in Syria. It's not been without a lot of its problems and challenges, but nonetheless, what was interesting, and it's the past couple of years, Netanyahu kind of was in this distinct position in history of Israel's foreign policy, where he had very strong overt backing from the United States, and he also had the strongest relationship that Israel had ever had with Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union, in its history as well. And so it was sort of, I'd say an interesting period of time for him and for Israel. Okay, looking beyond that, it seems like Israel is perfectly able to deconflict the various arms sales and deals that they do with everybody, along with their interactions with Russia and with Ukraine and the United States. It's a complex web because Russians were in the same boat on the sale of S-300 PMU-2 to the Iranians, remember? And Russians actually were not sure what Israelis would do because at the time they were depending on Israeli drone shipments. Since Russians have a licensed production agreement with Israelis, they assemble Israeli drones. They put 4-post on it, but inside it's really, Israeli Searcher 2. And they actually were waiting for Israelis to deliver the last shipments of parts as part of a contract before they made clear that they were making deliveries of S-300s to the Iranians, because they weren't necessarily sure how Israelis would react. So far, their relationships have survived all this, right? And remember, the principal supplier of drones to Azerbaijan was Israel, not Turkey. TB2s were a very small percentage of the drone fleet that Azerbaijan actually had. The bulk of them were Israelis. The ones that made a big difference were Israeli loitering munitions, and Azeris were using them as far back as 2016, which was their first kind of dry run at this type of conflict.
And the Armenians pulled back their ambassador because they were ticked at the Israelis just because of that. George, I'll give you the final word because I think we're at the end of our hour, so go ahead.
Well, what I'm going to do is use your raising of the Israeli question to attack what I think is a false impression on what's driving Russian behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine. As Mike points out, the Russian-Israeli relationship is a very healthy one. There are areas, of course, where they have differences of views, differences of interests. The Russians, I think, are quite understanding that Israel is going to do some things that, Russia may not like, but aren't motivated by fundamentally anti-Russian motives. They sell things to people. They have areas where they've got commercial interests that may be in conflict with the Russians, but they're able to manage these things. But the reason why I think this is significant is Israel is quite a robust democracy, and the Russians don't have a problem with that at all. There's not an ideological component to the Russian-Israeli relationship. And oftentimes you hear the argument that what's going on in Ukraine is that the Russians are afraid that Ukraine is turning into a democracy, and that fundamentally is threatening to Russia because Russia regards democracy as antithetical to Russia and the way it governs itself. And therefore it must be attacked. And you hear this not just as a driver in what the Russians are doing with Ukraine, but how they're dealing with the United States, that the United States, democracy in the United States threatens Russia and they're trying to stamp it out in some way. I don't think that's at all what's going on. I think what we have here is a clash of some fundamental interests, some fundamental geopolitical interests that are at the root of what's going on here. And this clash would occur whether Ukraine was announcing that it aspired to be a democracy or not. I think it has very little to do with the dynamics of this situation here.
I know we're in injury time, but Melinda, I saw you shaking your head. So obviously you're not in agreement. So you're going to get the last word.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It wouldn't be a real discussion if we didn't have any, if we didn't draw any blood. I fundamentally disagree with George. Moscow wants to keep Ukraine in chaos. The Donbass is a mechanism to increase pressure on Ukraine. Putin wants to prevent Ukraine from joining the West. He does not want Ukraine to become a vibrant Slavic democracy. He'll do anything he can to make it as hard as possible for Ukraine to become a really vibrant democracy. Thank you for the last word.
We got so far without that cleavage appearing in a discussion about Ukraine. You just couldn't make it to the end, folks.
You have to do another one of these. You guys have to wake up more at the beginning.
Do you want to jump in, Keith, since you haven't spoken?
No, I think that democracy has no place here in a sense of the discussions about Ukraine. In other words, what's going on and the tensions between Ukraine and Russia have everything to do with what has been the bulk of our discussions here, and very little to do with Ukraine's regime type. So in that sense, I'll close by agreeing with George, which of course is going to upset Melinda, but then we'll be reenacting something that we've done many times.
Okay, well, it was great to end on a lively note. And I really want to thank you because you all brought in so many different facets of what is going on and the complexities that I think are confronting an administration that really wouldn't want to have to worry about this right now. I mean, let's leave China out of it. They're trying to push through a $2 trillion bill, which is not going to be easy for them. And so I think the four of you have laid out in very clear and stark terms that however much the Biden people might want to look the other way, it's not clear that they can. And if they do want to look the other way, they need to do it consciously, not subconsciously. So I thank all of you, and I hope that our audience learned a lot. I certainly did, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.